All right. Well, it falls to me to welcome our last guest, a Canadian, an outspoken member of the information security community. I would say with a brand that has global recognition. I'd like to welcome Dave Lewis, Gattaca. Thank you so much for making this, Dave. I understand that you are suffering from both jet lag and flight delays today. Um,
Thank
so
you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about what people need to know about Gattaca, the brand, and Dave Lewis, the person.
Well, see, I never really subscribed to the brand. I just a guy that's been doing this for far too long, and I've made a lot of mistakes along the way. So I get to share my stories, and hopefully people can learn from it. And that's the way I like to position myself.
That's a great thing because obviously we've got some great Canadian people working in Canada, but you do a fair amount of work internationally. Do you want to
Yes.
talk a little bit about what countries 2019 brought you to?
Oh boy. Spin the wheel. This year I did about 360,000 kilometers worth of travel, and that took me to Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, Greece, UK, US, Canada, um, Italy, Germany. I mean, it just keeps going and going.
Yeah. So basically, what was on your mind in 2019? What were your sort of keynotes and sort of the key synopsis, if you will, of what you're thinking?
Well, the vast majority of what I've been tackling is sort of rooted in my first talk that I gave back in 2013, where I talked about supply chain security. And everybody sort of looked at me like I had three heads back then, and suddenly in these days everybody's talking about it, which is kind of cool. And it's just looking at security in a much different way, because I remember years ago, after having an external pen test done, trying to explain the results to the CIO at this particular company, and them saying, "Oh, it's okay, we have a firewall, everything's fine." And that sort of really made me realize that we have to get back to tackling fundamental security. Um, the tenants that we have seem to have drifted away from, chasing the ooh shiny or the 0 day of the day.
Hmm.
And I think that focus that we have lost collectively is something that we really need to pay attention to. Doing things like vilifying vendors and looking at, oh, look at that 0 day. We sort of lose focus because, one, it's not always correct. And two, it's a wasted effort when we should really be looking at core things like network zone segmentation, logging, patching. I mean, I know nobody finds any of that sexy per se.
It's far from sexy.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? This is
It's
how we stay
effective.
in the business.
Yeah, yeah. So you said you've been doing this for a real long time. So how did you get started, and and how did you sort of come up, to be a very in demand kind of speaker?
That part I still wrap my head around because reasons, but
Yeah.
it actually all started when I used to work for a record company back in the day called MCA Records, and then ultimately changed to Universal Music. And we had a computer system installed at the office, and I rapidly found that I enjoyed that. I had started out with computers back in 1983, so I did have some sort of understanding of it. And I also realized that nobody in the music industry grows old per se. Um,
Okay.
it's not an industry that is kind to older folks, and I
Gotcha.
realized that early on. I was at a conference, or rather an award ceremony, and the MC said, "Look around the room." He said, "The only people with gray hair in here will be in a ponytail, and they'll be the CEO." Of the five CEOs in the room, four had gray hair and ponytails, and I went, "Okay, time to change."
Yeah.
And that's when I made the jump into information technology. At first, started out as a rapid application developer, and then I think 10 days into my first job as a developer, I realized that the security team for this bank of 55,000 employees had one security person.
Wow. Yeah.
And I went, okay, put up my hand, because at that point in time, I was running my own botnet. So I went, this is something that definitely interests me.
Very, very cool. And I guess, that goes to the point where what we've done in the past may come back to haunt us in the future. But I want to go back to the music career. So what did you think when, file sharing started happening in the music industry, a la Napster? Because you were around during that time, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That actually came after I left the record company. The really funny thing about it was that when I had my original interview at MCA, they asked me where I saw the music industry going. And I said, in the next 5 years, I imagine we will be buying music online.
And they hated that. I
Really,
bet.
I was actually laughed at. And he said, oh, that
Oh.
would just mean everybody would have to have a special device they could download music onto. I said, yeah, if I had any idea how right I was going to be, my goodness,
Yeah. Yeah.
that was a missed opportunity there.
Yeah. So we're at the tail end of a plus 24-hour 40 plus speaker or even more speakers. Um, you know, it's great to have you here because you've got that sort of long arc of information security from a country not known for incredibly aggressive foreign policy. I think that's fair to say. How do you see did you see, do you see the internet fragmenting along geopolitical lines, or do you feel that it still has that open kind of all information should be free type of character?
Unfortunately, I see things leaning more to a draconian side than I want them to be. When I go back to the early days in the 90s there where like we were freely sharing everything. I mean, I had my own file shares going, sharing wares and all the rest of it. And it was very common to share books and things to that effect. But nowadays, I see it very much tilting in a way that I'm not overly enthusiastic about, I'll be honest. I do see it fracturing along geopolitical lines. I know of at least two countries that have set up um, contingencies so that if they had to, they could shut off the rest of the world and operate their own internal internet.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the pieces of the puzzle are there. It just they haven't been all put together, and I really don't like the picture that's going to develop as a result.
I need a DHCP server for 1.8 million devices, all routed on a 10.x network.
We laugh, but I know that exists right now.
Yeah.
And how do you think that plays into things like nation states and states attacking each other?
Well, the funny thing is there's typically 3 or 4 countries that are routinely vilified by the media as being the evil types on the internet. But the reality is any country that has an internet connection has some sort of program in place.
Right.
Yes, they attack each other, but more to the effect of mining for information and gathering information. In some cases, you have countries that are going out there trying to steal currency because of tariffs and all the rest of it that they have applied to them. But yeah, it's really interesting to watch it fracturing along geopolitical lines. I think we are at the second world crypto wars at this point. We saw the earlier version of that, but I honestly see us stumbling into that.
You're referring to crypto backdoors being mandated by countries?
That's another example of it. That's another front that I see developing, which I do have a very distinct problem with.
Yeah.
While I understand their point of view, I do not necessarily agree with it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you go to a bunch of different international conferences. Is there any sort of characteristics that are sort of unique to those kind of conferences? So you mentioned that you'd spent a lot of time in Asia. What is the information security scene like in Asia these days?
There is actually a pretty strong group there for sure, from one country to the next. But you have the cultural nuances that play into the information security teams or groups rather in those countries. So you will see things like if I give a presentation in Japan, if I crack a joke, it'll probably fall flat because culturally it's not acceptable to laugh at the speaker. Whereas in the Philippines, God love them, they'll be rolling in the aisles if I, happen to land a good joke.
All right, good note for the Beer Farmers Future Tour.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, I do see a very, very strong, especially in Singapore, there is a very strong security community there, and it's just growing.
It's rated as the #1 security country in the world, according to the ITU.
They don't mess around.
Yeah. And on that note, do you feel that, Canadian law enforcement is not up to spec on this, or do you feel like we're doing the best we can in a very Canadian sense? Or
well, being Canadian, we tend to do things quietly. We have like if discussion was a currency, we'd be the richest country in the world.
and apologies.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is there is a very strong security underlay here as well. Like we look at CSE, which is our
Yeah.
Canadian version of the NSA, for want of a better term. They do very excellent work in their own right. As well, I mean, I'm familiar with folks from the RCMP and the work they've done. One of their now retired members was a long time contributor to the NCASE software.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
he provided all sorts of software for that he wrote of his own volition and provided it. It just some of the examples, and we also have things like Citizen Lab in Toronto. So there's a lot of it. We just tend to be not as vocal as other countries may be.
Yeah, yeah.
But
So
can it be better? Always.
I'm going to transition a little bit because we're ticking down the final kind of minutes here.
Yeah.
If there was somebody out there that was really like interested and has the passion, all right, for information security, what would be sort of your advice on getting their career kickstarted? What do you see as being sort of like the most effective, biggest bang for the buck?
Well, see, this is the crazy thing of it is these days you can use all sorts of online courses. There's all sorts of communities that you can get involved with. Despite the fact that Twitter can be a toxic stew, it's a great way to meet all sorts of people.
Fair.
So networking is key, reaching out, introducing yourself, and, being civil about it too.
Yeah.
Don't go, hey, look at me, I'm Neo. No, you're not. No, nobody is.
No.
Let's get over ourselves. Being willing, to ask questions and not being afraid to hear the answers, because, we're not always good at listening collectively. But when I started back in the day, there was literally, 3 or 4 people that were talking on, IRC and the rest of it. And I mean, obviously I'm being facetious at that point, but anything we had to learn was by ripping it apart and figuring it out, because there weren't university courses in it. There weren't anything, no videos you could just watch online. Yeah. So the opportunities there are absolutely plentiful. It's just a matter of having the wherewithal to reach out, ask questions, and do the digging and find the information.
Right. Right. And I guess, Canada is a tough one because we have these vast geographic distances and the cost of travel too, to make it to the conferences. That's a huge challenge. So I guess, virtual and YouTube courses is probably the more popular and least inexpensive way to gain the knowledge.
And a lot of the conferences stream their content as well live. Yeah. In addition to that, a lot of them actually provide all this information later on YouTube. So those talks do tend to show up. And are freely available in many cases.
So, one of the things that you mentioned, Ian, is the traveling and that. So, Dave, do you think things like what we're doing right here will be helpful and be something that might become more common?
But when you say things around here, what do you?
Oh, he's talking about our virtual conference.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. This is the kind of thing that needs to happen more often, because whereas I'm able to travel the world to meet all of these, customers and people and talk about security issues, that's not something that everybody has that opportunity to. And I'm very aware of that. So something like this is a huge benefit to hit the wider audience, because there's a lot of folks coming up. In most of the conferences I speak at, I'll ask a simple question. I'll say, how many people in this room have been here in this industry for 2 years? And then I'll say 5 years, 10 years, and just to get a gauge of the room. Invariably, about 75 to 80% of the room has only been at this for 2 years.
Yeah.
So it just shows that there is a huge appetite for content.
Is it fair to say that the content challenges, because we talked to a few people working in cloud-based platforms, and one comment Gabe mentioned was cloud is sort of beta still, and people are running apps in it, and it changes. It's a very dynamic place.
It's a dynamic place, but I mean, I don't see that as a detractor in any way, shape, or form.
Okay.
The detractor I see is when people go crashing into it without all the information they need to do it. Like S3 buckets on AWS are a great example.
Right.
With a credit card and a web browser, you can spin one of these up, put any sort of data in it you want, excuse me, and then carry on. But the problem is the vast majority of people that set these up don't have a security understanding or a background in many cases. And we as security practitioners, it's incumbent upon us to share that information, to teach them so they don't make simple mistakes like making these buckets public.
Yeah.
By default, these are set to private. There's even a banner across the screen that says, for the love of all is holy, please don't set it public.
Right.
I may be paraphrasing.
Yeah. But you've got to deliberately misconfigure your assets in cloud, I think, generally speaking, for them to be now. But we hear about in the news, even today, leaky S3 bucket and this, that, and the other data breach, blah, blah, blah. But actually, and the technology gets blamed often.
Yes.
For the problem, when actually it's misconfiguration, and that's not the technology, right?
I think,
and this is where I have a problem, because that tends to be vilifying the end user, which I have a serious problem with, because 9 times out of 10, these are folks that actually have never been taught or do not understand. So I take that as a personal failure on our side as security practitioners for not communicating that out.
I agree.
But just to turn, I agree now is not the technology, but there was a point in time where the technology was a problem. And my perception is the security folk were not brought in to kind of say, hey, what about this and this? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I worked back in the days where we had cave paintings. So, I mean, I'm very familiar. I'm very familiar coming along to how things have transitioned, because security was seen as, in some cases, not even an afterthought, but something to be routed around. And these days, it's well understood that this is a conversation to have up front. So you have £1 up front you can pay, or 10,000 pounds on the back end to fix the problem.
Yeah.
So it is in a risk discussion, that's a whole lot more sense to have that conversation before the bad things happen.
Agreed. And ultimately, whether we're building a server on-prem or in the cloud, the problems have been there forever. And what drives infrastructure and software and systems to be built is get them working, right?
Yeah.
Get them working. Are they operational? Yes. I mean, we talked about this in the previous talk. Does it work? Yeah, fine. Great. Move on. Next project. And that historically has been the problem. In cloud, similar problem. Ian, you've spoken about this before.
Yep.
Get everything working. And if that means getting a security group in AWS fucked around with so that you've got various different...
And access control lists, and encryption after the F5 load balancer, and encrypted databases. Like everybody knows how to do this stuff. Or knows, I'm going to say, the theory behind it. But where it seems to fall apart is when you're dealing with the tech stack and there's minor incompatibilities or stuff are at different, release levels, and then just to meet that production deadline, things are cut, right?
Just make it work.
Just make it work. And I know, when you go in post audit and you look at these things, sometimes you can get away with putting the database connections into IPsec tunnels, for instance, as a workaround solution, right? But not if it's a high latency thing. So, we're always battling and, trying to retroactively apply, security. And this is also because it's shifting sands from the audit and compliance perspective, right? As a great example, I know of an audit finding that wanted 16 character service passwords now. There are systems, perhaps even Dave Lewis has worked on them, that don't physically have the capability of a 16 character password. In fact, the operating system is locked at 8.
I can confirm.
Yeah. So your Spark platform, for instance, is a great example. Not going to be compliant with that audit finding, right? So, Dave, we're wrapping it up here because we've had a long haul. If you could impart some of your wisdom to the next generation coming up, you talked about getting involved. What technologies do you think that they need to know moving forward?
Well, the technologies I would put to one side. I would say learn how to communicate and learn how to write.
Yeah.
Those are key fundamentals, because if you cannot communicate what it is that you're trying to address in a salient fashion, it's never going to get done. And then we find ourselves running a standstill. Sorry,
a Visio diagram is like a very powerful tool, and unfortunately, I don't see enough of them.
Well, even now we look at stuff like AWS and Google Cloud and all the rest of it. The issue I have there is Visio doesn't even work anymore because of the scale that you can spin up in a matter of hours.
Yeah.
So where I could build out an infrastructure for a data center, which literally took me about a year and a half to do, I can now do that in the space of 2 days.
Yeah.
So it just, rant off.
No, but also, I guess it's not about the tech, is it? You're right, Dave. It's about the approach and the method by which you develop technology.
Yep.
If you look at AWS, then I guess you code as much as you possibly can. So that means in AWS terms, you're talking about cloud formation, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got something you can review. You've not got somebody spinning up an EC2 instance manually and doing all that configuration around it. It's all done in a formatted and well understood configuration file or files. And therein is also your documentation. So if you've got properly built infrastructure using code, then you can read that code and you can understand how the infrastructure is being built. That's my take.
Assuming the code is documented properly, and I've yet to find any that I've ever called documented properly.
You will one day. You will
one day. Yes, yeah. Yes. On my deathbed, I'll be like, aha.
Developers document.
Yeah. Every chance. All right. So, I think we're out of time. But Sean, do you want to ask?
Just one really quick question, Dave.
Yeah.
What is an advisory CISO? I've been intrigued by that title, so I'm really curious what that means.
Well, this is a role that I started at Akamai when I was there for 5 years. And then when I transitioned over to Duo and now Cisco, it came with me. So it basically is a conversation. How do I put it? A glorified talking head is the easiest way to put it. It's somebody that goes around. I speak at about 40 or 45 conferences a year, trying to impart ideas of, supply chain security or zero trust or getting back to core fundamentals. So having the conversations and trying to share lessons learned from, I spent 20 years as a defender before I crossed into the vendor space. And, being able to have these conversations in a non-fuddy way and not going, hey, look at that vendor over there. They're terrible. That doesn't further the conversation in any way, shape, or form.
And it's un-Canadian.
Well, exactly. There you go. But yeah, no, it's about, having those conversations. So I get to, meet at conferences, meet with customers, and I do a lot of security research as well. I haven't done any vulnerability disclosure since 2008, I think was my last one. Oddly enough, the same year my daughter was born. So that was pretty much the end of that. But so that's the role is very much about infecting the bloodstream and trying to get the point across that we can, and we do have the ability to do a better job.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really, really cool.
Yeah, and I get to see the world too, which is an added bonus.
Very nice.
Yeah, that's nice.
Very nice. Okay, Dave. Many thanks indeed for getting involved.
Thank you so much for having me after my little misstep earlier.
No, that's absolutely superb. So thank you for your insights. Thank you for your time. And thank you for wrapping up BeerCon 1.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was an honor to be here.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.
Cheers.